going to bind the neckline. The first thing to do is to mark the back, obviously, or we have done it already, and the center back as well. And then you line those up with the binding and put a pin there so you know where it goes. And I've just got to say that this binding is too long. There wasn't enough gather, so when you're going to do it and then sew it on, turn it over and turn it in, it's going to be perfect. But when I did it, I made it a little bit too long. So what you won't be seeing here is that I unpicked it all again and did it again. So if it goes on a little bit too easy here without any of the fronts and back gathering up, then that's why. But it will gather up quite a bit when you're doing it yourself, as it should be. So we pin it to the back here, and now I take the front and I'm going to put that right on here, and it needs to stand over the edge a bit so that when we turn it in and down, it's not too short. So make sure that you have it standing over. Don't do it like this because it's going to be too short, right? We want it to stand over the edge so that it goes to there, right? And then I'm going to just put a pin in here that holds it in place. Lay it nice and flat, and then you just work your hands towards the middle and you pin it there. And you can see I didn't have enough there tension. And a lot of you will just want to be doing this on the sewing machine. You mark the back and you maybe mark one in the 4/4 or something, but then you go on the sewing machine. I just do it entirely at the sewing machine and make this a very, very quick dress. But of course, if you're doing it for the first time, you might want to do it on a work table like I'm doing here. And you can see I made it quite a bit shorter, but that was not short enough. It needs to really hold it in quite substantially, and especially if you're working with 100% cotton, because that really doesn't recover. So what happens is it's just going to stretch and stretch and stretch. So the binding needs to be way shorter. But it still came out all right. I worked my way around it. But when I was finished with the dress, of course, I was dead chuffed with it. So it was worth the effort. But when you're working with 100% cotton, it is really important that you use the binding measurement in the ebook that is way, way shorter. So that you don't have to fiddle as much. You will have to steam in a little bit, but I had to do it excessively. It's not a bad thing for teaching video because you can see how you can get around it. If you, for example, were just lining this and you weren't putting on any binding to hold it in, then also all these tips and tricks will really help you get it right. And now I can sew this on. So I'm popping over to my sewing machine and we're sewing with either foot width or 1 centimeter seam allowance. That's up to you. I tend to work foot width. It doesn't really matter too much as there's not much in it, but that's up to you really. Don't stretch the fabric that is underneath it. The only thing that needs stretching is the top, which is why sometimes pins are actually more of a hindrance than they are helpful. So concentrate on not stretching the dress, just the binding. So professionals would just have the binding in one hand and stretch it. That's what I do. I don't even measure it. So I was surprised when I did this pattern how much I actually stretch it. For me, it's way easier to just have a certain amount of pull, and do that all the way around, and I get it very evenly. But of course, when you do it for the first or second or 10th time even, it is much better to have the measurements. So I have worked them out painstakingly for you so that you can get it right. But yeah, so move all the way around. I just actually love this fabric. It's from Birch, from Fabric Worm here in California. It's an organic fabric. And I've worn this dress now quite a few times, and I still find my neckline a little bit loose, but it is just so comfy. It's just so beautiful. You could now overlock what we've just sewn and then just use that as the neckline, but it will come out wider. So if you wanted to do that, you would have to trim the seam allowance off when you're cutting out, obviously, so that it doesn't become too wide and looks frumpy, right? So, but it does look nice, I have to say. I think it's beautiful. So now what we're going to do is some understitching, and again it will stretch my fabric again. And so it was very important that your binding is very taut on there, because every step of the way you're stretching your fabric back out afterwards. So what I'm going to do now is cut back the seam allowance through the center so that it's a bit flatter. And then when that rolls over, it's going to be much nicer. Cutting away all the way around. I have to say that on a quick dress, if I wanted to make a quick dress and it was a very light fabric, I just cut it back in one go, right? I don't bother with that. I don't bother with ironing it after. I do all these steps straight on the machine. I cut back, I understitch, I top stitch, right? But when you're doing it with a cotton like this, which will stretch, it is important to do it in steps. So at this point, once it's cut back, I go back to my ironing board and I'll steam it back in, because I don't want it to stretch. And I want it to look really, really nice and pristine. So for my super dress, and not a quick summer dress, which takes about 35 minutes to sew, this will take you more like an hour and a half, I think, if you do it the way I do it here. I think that's roughly what it will take you. I'm obviously a bit faster, she says. But this actually did take quite a long time to make, especially filming it all as well. There we go, and I'll steam it in so that when I understitch it and it gets stretched again, I don't stretch it so it doesn't look nice. So if you put your pattern back on, you'll see how much I've just steamed that in, right? So it really went and sorted out the shape there. It took away quite a bit. By the time I've finished with this, it will actually look exactly the same as my pattern piece again, right? So I'm just checking that I've steamed it in the same amount, careful not to stretch anything. Oh, that was not as easy. And now I'm going to stitch my seam allowance to the binding, and that's called understitching. Understitching can also work the other way around, but this time we're stitching the binding to the seam allowance. And I'm stitching right on the edge here. And I have to say, even though this was hard to do, out of all the 3 dresses I've made just for this little sewing course, I have to say that I think that I've almost liked this one the best. I wish I'd made it a whole size smaller. That's another thing that I would like to point out to you guys. If you're working with 100% cotton and you have this kind of stretch, unless you are using a different type of fabric for your binding, then the binding will hold it in anyway, but it's very likely to stretch quite a bit. And as you could see in my introduction, I made those dresses in the same size, but this looks significantly bigger in the cotton. I think what that really needs is a good wash and put in the dryer. So now you can see that this stretched again, right? So I'll have to steam it in again. That's the thing with 100% cotton, but worthwhile doing, because it is a very comfortable dress and I'm going to love wearing this all summer long. And maybe it's not a bad thing, it's a bit looser if it gets really hot. I live in LA, it does get very hot in the summer. Then at least I've got something that isn't too clingy, because you might not actually want that. On the back you can see it especially how that's stretched out. Oh my goodness. So it was so important to make that binding shorter so you wouldn't have that problem. I could have cut all this out of the footage, but that's not how I roll. I might make another video where I show it with a different fabric where we're using the right amount of lycra, just so you can see it, and just overlocking all seams and go, 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 like I do. I tend to make multiple videos, but for now we just do it with this video, and I hope that you really learn something about how to manipulate your fabric to get it looking beautiful, no matter what fabric you work with. On this side as well. Important to get it all nice and straight and have it sitting really nice and flat. You hover your iron over the top and you give it all that steam first before you put the iron actually on. And now I'm going to put these over, and look how nice that would look if I just left it like that. I think it's actually absolutely gorgeous. I almost wish I'd done that. Maybe another time. And I'm going to turn it in now, and when you stitch it close to the edge of the binding, it's really easy to like have it really wibbly wobbly. So we're going to stitch it from the outside, from the upper side of the fabric. And to make sure that we do it the right way, if you're doing it for the first time, we're ironing this over like I'm doing here. For all you experts out there that have made loads of dresses like that, obviously you just go to the sewing machine and roll it over with your hands and it's no issue. You don't have to necessarily do this step with the ironing, but on this particular fabric I wanted to make sure that I don't accidentally stretch anything, and I wanted it to look really, really good. So now I'm going to top stitch this from the top because it is easier, just in case the binding isn't totally even on the other side. It's so easy then to make it wibbly wobbly, right? So if you're stitching it from the outside though, you just put your presser foot on there, and then you find a fixed point that you line the edge of the fabric up with, and then you push your fabric in. What you don't do is you don't pull this at all. This is effectively another stay stitch. So you're pushing the fabric in and you never ever pull on it, because on this final stitch that would do you in if it's like cotton, just 100% of this stuff that has no recovery, right? It's just like literally, well, it has a little bit of recovery. I'd give it 5%. It's not enough, right? Look how lovely that looks. You're getting a beautiful stitching line. And very important also is that your stitch length is about 3.5. Don't do it like really low because it'll look very homemade and dinky and it'll just go in the same spot, and literally it's not very nice. So you want your stitch length to be rather long, and that looks the nicest. And this distance to the edge of the neckline here is just under that foot width. It's just the next little marking over. Doesn't that look absolutely stunning? It is really beautiful. And now that I'm done and I can look at it, I'll go, ha, glad I finished this now. So now we can go on to closing the side seams.